So what we'll do now is move straight on to the next paper, which is covering Scotland, and this is being given by John Atkinson. John is a graduate of the University of Glasgow, where he completed his master's degree and doctorate before joining Glasgow University Archaeological Research Division in 1996, until that unit was disbanded in 2010. And in 2011, he co-founded GARD, which is as its managing director. John's worked in commercial archaeology for 30 years and undertaken significant research projects such as the Ben Lawes Historic Landscape Project, and his research interests include Scottish rural settlement and early industries during the medieval and post-medieval periods. So John, thank you very much for agreeing to speak today. The floor is yours.
I just wanted to start off initially by thanking Carenza and Susan for organising this and giving me the opportunity to speak, and I've also got some thanks for colleagues in other commercial units who've been kind enough to give me feedback when I've asked questions about what they've been up to. So my paper today seeks to draw together evidence of medieval rural settlement from infrastructure projects in Scotland over the last 20 years and present that in the context of Scottish medieval rural studies as a whole for the same period. The aim here is to provide a degree of clarity on what we actually mean by medieval rural settlement in a Scottish context. I'll also seek to clarify and define what counts as an infrastructure project in 21st century Scotland, as opposed to other commercial development projects. I'll also seek to provide a context of a period of study by casting an eye back to research projects that framed the later discoveries and establish a body of work that sought to address questions on where medieval rural settlements might survive, be found, or how they may be constituted in a time when little documentary evidence cast light on the subject. Finally, I will discuss some recent discoveries by presenting 3 case studies drawn from recently published sites associated with infrastructure projects in Scotland, and cast an eye over other commercial developments over the last 20 years that have added immeasurably to our understanding of medieval settlement studies in Scotland. So we'll start off with some, I guess, definitions and meanings. The background to rural settlement studies in Scotland has been shaped by the history of the discipline and the lack of evidence of medieval settlement pattern in the lowlands in particular. Consequently, the study's taken a wider definition, and the term medieval or later rural settlement has been used to draw together the study to the north of the border. New slide, please. However, for the purpose of this paper, I've sought to use the term medieval rural settlement and define it chronologically here as rural settlement broadly of the early and late medieval periods. In addition to the chronological periods, it's essential we define what constitutes rural settlement. Where do we draw the line here between settlement forms? What constitutes a deserted medieval village as opposed to a small town? In a Scottish context, a clear case could be made to argue that some medieval boroughs were just another form of rural settlement and relied heavily on their hinterland. I'm thinking here of, for instance, Mary Peter Anna's work at Cromarty. Slide, please. However, for this study, we'll take the specific view that rural settlement will mean joint tenancy farms, cottage houses, deserted villages. We'll even look at moated enclosures here as well, a sort of form of defended farmstead. When Carenza approached me to speak, she specifically referred to the impact on medieval rural settlement by large infrastructure projects, which for someone who's worked in commercial archaeology for much of his career, it conjured up an aspect of what that might be. So in this talk, I've assumed that infrastructure projects will be the focus. We'll focus specifically on linear infrastructure projects such as road, water, wastewater, gas, electricity schemes, where medieval settlements have given us some knowledge. Given the lack of evidence of rural medieval settlement forms in Scotland, I've assumed that in general there's no perceived threat as such from linear infrastructure schemes, but a clear opportunity to add to our knowledge and understanding of the period in question. Context in the Highlands. Projects principally by the Royal Commission for Scotland, which would focus attention on relic medieval landscapes of upland Perthshire. Image please. These discoveries would ultimately lead to further research excavations focused on new discoveries and the potential for a better understanding of medieval rural settlement pattern in general. Excavations at Pitcarmick and latterly in Glen Shee, combined with university research projects in the Western Isles, began to add significant detail to the early medieval and late medieval study of form and settlement within landscapes on the edge of modern farming systems. My own work in the Central Highlands was greatly assisted by another Royal Commission study, and once again fragments of the upland rural settlement pattern were encountered and excavated and add to the corpus of understanding for that period. Slide please. The Ben Lawes Historic Landscape Project, which runs a series of initial pilot seasons in the late 1990s and main seasons from 2002 to 2005, also sought to address the location of medieval settlements in lower-lying arable lands along the lochside. This was focused through two main methodological strands of investigation: geophysics and trial trenching, and targeted excavation of later buildings. Image please. Both strands utilised the available map-based evidence and documentary references to target known sites which had a degree of longevity and could therefore be sites of medieval joint tenancy farms. The results of the targeted excavations certainly added to our knowledge of the post-medieval period, and in one case revealed traces of the prehistoric past, however failed to reveal the medieval aspects of these sites. Likewise, the targeting of areas where settlements had existed in the mid-18th century estate plans, slide please, but were absent today by geophysics and trial trenching also proved to be a negative strategy during the project. The reasons for this failure in terms of targeting may well relate to the form of the buildings and materials used, principally biodegradable materials, turf, straw, timber, for the construction of much of the buildings in Highland Scotland, rather than a failure of the technique itself. Although upland research, particularly in the Highlands, has aimed to address the missing settlement pattern of the medieval period, little in the way of significant infrastructure impact has occurred that adds to our understanding. Major projects such as the dualling of the A9 between Perth and Caithness, a planned 25-year-long development project covering some 300 miles of road, has to date revealed nothing of significance to our understanding of the arable and upland zones throughout the Highlands during this period. The picture in the lowlands and the arable zone south of the Highland line has proved to be unclear at best. Although a series of significant road schemes have been undertaken in recent years, in many of Scotland's major roads, as well as a whole host of bypass projects, few traces of medieval settlement sites have been encountered by 2010. In fact, the only site discovered during fairly extensive fieldwork with major infrastructure projects was during preparatory investigations in advance of the construction of the A78 Ardrossan Saltcoats Stevenson bypass in 2003. Trial trenching by headland archaeology revealed the remains of a site known as Corsenkill, which subsequent excavations proved to be 15th to 16th century in date. Slide please. The remains revealed at Corsenkill, although relatively late in date, combined with Morag Cross's assessment of the documents, suggests that the focus of the settlement may have been elsewhere from the 12th century, when it's first mentioned in the documentary record, and moved to the location of discovery in the 15th century, prior to moving again in the 19th century. The sequence of settlement movement combined with historical data is something which is replicated on a regular basis during this kind of investigation. From our own company's archives, we can point to further examples of medieval settlement remains being encountered during infrastructure projects in Scotland during the last 10 years, and I'll look at each of these a little bit more detail in this talk. Cast my mind back though a little further to the 1990s, I can think of one other discovery made during an infrastructure project. In this case, it wasn't a road scheme that led to the discovery of a Pictish and later medieval settlement in the arable zone, but a new water pipeline in Fife, a site called Scots Tarvet to the south of Cooper. Unlike Corsoncale, here the physical remains were represented by negative cut features, possibly defining buildings and dated by pottery and radiocarbon assays. Garda Archaeology has been fortunate that we have encountered a number of medieval settlement sites in relatively recent past and been able to bring them forward to publication. This has included 2 village sites at Philpot to the south-east of Selkirk and Netherton to the northwest of Hamilton. In addition, the discovery of an excavation of medieval building to the west of Kintore in Aberdeenshire has added a further dimension to the corpus of remains encountered during infrastructure projects. Medieval settlement remains at Philpot near Selkirk in late 2012, early 2013 provided a tantalising glimpse into late medieval lifestyles in the Scottish borders. Can I have a slide please? Originally necessitated by the positioning of a new water pipeline running close to the A703 through the edge of the scheduled monument, thought to be the remains of an Anglian settlement, the archaeological constraints here meant that metal detector survey and subsequent watching brief became necessary. To complicate the picture further, the location was also known for the Battle of Philpot in 1645 and as such had clear potential. To reduce the risk to the known archaeology, the way leave was minimised for this section of pipeline to no more than 2 metres in width. Although metal detector survey revealed little of significance, the battle site's likely to have been stripped by detectorists in the past. The watching brief revealed extensive remains of cobbled surfaces, walls, hearths, pivot stones throughout the scheduled area and also extending westwards out of it. Slide please. Radiocarbon dating suggested a date range of 1472 to 1645, although a date in the mid to late 16th century looks more likely. The town of Philpot is recorded in historical documents in 1582 as being constituted by a tower, fortalice, manors, gardens, orchards, mills, tenants and dwellings. It seems likely the remains encountered during this investigation have revealed a slice through some of those structures. Interestingly, the town itself doesn't seem to have survived beyond the first half of the 17th century, as contemporary accounts of the battle in 1645 do not record its presence on the battlefield. It's also worth reflecting on the date of the remains known from the aerial photographs to the Anglian period. Although this may be correct, other interpretations might hold more currency given the new evidence. I'd now like to turn my attention to a different kind of infrastructure project, namely area investigation necessitated by the building of a new electricity substation in Kintore, Aberdeenshire. Slide please. At Kintore, the physical remains were located within a 19th century tree planting area known as the Hart Plantation and were encountered as an upstanding structure, initially thought to be associated with the adjacent 19th century stockyard. Further investigation revealed that the building was overlain by the stockyard wall and was hip-ended rather than square. Excavation of the building revealed that stone walls sat directly on top of subsoil and it had few internal features present and no sign of a hearth. Slide please. The only exception to this was the presence of shallow post holes surviving along the base of the wall and the western end of the building, suggesting a crook frame support for the roof. Dating wise, a few securely stratified sherds of redware survived and suggest abandonment sometime in the 15th century, although it's tempting to view its association with the stockyard as providing further use during the 19th century as shelter for young animals as being likely. The mixing of human use and animal use may well give some explanation to the rather skewed sequence of radiocarbon dates, suggesting use in prehistory, early historic period, the later medieval period. On the basis of the evidence, the excavator proposed a date for the site in the 14th to 15th century, and its original form was that of a stone and turf built structure. Slide please. Similar to those encountered at Pitcairnmouth and Ben Lawers and on South Uist, interestingly, the recurrent theme of turf and stone buildings with odd date sequences was also apparent in Ben Lawers and two of the medieval buildings excavated, T16 and T17, which also had prehistoric and early historic dates, as well as a main phasing from the later medieval period. Returning to linear infrastructure projects, third and final example of significant discoveries associated with expansion and upgrade of the road network in Scotland comes from the programme of excavations conducted in support of the M8, M73, M74 motorway improvement scheme in 2013-14. Slide please. Recently published on Archaeology Reports Online, this project involved the widening of the southbound carriageway of the M74 motorway as it passed Hamilton in South Lanarkshire. The widening works ran from the edge of the motorway to the former site of the Netherton Cross, a 10th century carved cross in the style of the Govan stones, which had been relocated in the early 20th century to a safer location in Hamilton. Monitoring of the site strip at Netherton revealed evidence of other structures present in close proximity to the live motorway, and came as a surprise given the general assumption that verges would have suffered considerable impact during the construction of the road. Slide please. If it were not for the former location of the Netherton Cross and the adjacent Low Parks scheduled monument across the opposite side of the motorway, it's very unlikely that the archaeological monitoring of the verge would have been considered in this particular project. Discovery of the remains of 4 structures in close proximity to the cross represents the last vestiges of late medieval settlement at Netherton. This site may also be the site of Cadzow, which is a recurrent name within the area. Slide please.
You've got 5 minutes, John.
Sorry?
You've got 5 minutes.
Thank you for that. The buildings themselves appear to date from the early 14th century to the first quarter of the 17th century, and may have stood as late as the 1790s before being swept away by the Duke of Hamilton's improvements. The presence of the 10th century cross on the edge of the village is of note and suggests a degree of longevity to occupation may have occurred, a feature that's supported to a degree by a pit below structure 1 filled with material dating to the late 10th to early 12th century AD. The discovery of an excavation of sites at Philpot, Kintore and Netherton, although adding significantly to the corpus of medieval settlement results for the lowlands, has constrained the nature of the sites that was deemed possible in limited investigations. As such, our view of sites has been limited to a glimpse or a snapshot of the past. This is particularly the case for Philpot, where further investigation in the future may add significantly to what was achieved as part of this investigation. The results from Kintore were as complete in terms of what was discovered, while Netherton was as complete as the constraints of the project would allow. Moving beyond infrastructure, we enter the realms of greater possibility when it comes to excavating sites. Snapshots and open area excavations are not the means by which we gauge results. Indeed, we are offered greater potential for results to take on board, wider potential for complete building excavations, relationships between buildings, and importantly, an assessment of the gaps between buildings. The background to the last 20 years has been set by open area excavations in a relatively small number of sites, the most notable being Rattray in Aberdeenshire, Springwood Park in Kelso. Since 2000, a small number of other sites have added to this. And much of this has been the result of mining, quarrying, golf courses, house building and general development. from sites of single buildings like Gaswater near Cronbury, excavated by Headland, to the excavation of Lane Newton by Glasgow University Archaeological Research Division. Slide, please. However, the site has probably provided the greatest amount of knowledge as of El Bottle and the Archfield estate in East Lothian. Discovered initially during trial excavation by Headland Archaeology in 1999 and then more fully excavated in 2003. It was followed by further investigation in advance of a golf course to the west of the original discoveries by ALC Archaeology in 2006. Both phases of excavation provided broad dating of 400 to 1400 AD. Around the same time, CFA Archaeology were doing a similar kind of excavation in Dunbar. Slide, please. Although significant artefact assemblage was recovered, artefacts were of less significance in comparison to the El Bottle or Kelso sites. Although there's been relatively few medieval settlement sites excavated during infrastructure projects in Scotland in the last 10 years, a growing number of sites have been located and excavated, and the future looks bright in terms of potential for more. However, it's worth noting that commercial development as a whole has provided Scottish archaeology with numerous other opportunities to expand our collective knowledge of medieval settlement since 2000, and I hope my rather quick whistle-stop tour has given some idea of how collective knowledge has increased immeasurably over that period. I think it's no exaggeration to say that we have witnessed a bit of a sea change in comparison to our state of knowledge in 1999. Thank you for your time.